Hello and welcome. It has been a week that's seen intense strain on the US-Israel relationship. President Biden issuing an ultimatum to its strategic ally in the Middle East. If IDF troops storm Rafah, key weapon supplies will stop.
Alone, we stand alone. I've said it before, if we have to, we fight tooth and nail.
Your founders declared that this nation, in the wake of Hamas's appalling, this cabinet came together and standing united.
On a rare grand tour of Europe, history is at a turning point, said the French president, who hopes personal diplomacy can make a difference to tense relations.
These are the books I'd like to present you as a gift. They are the Chinese translations of French novels.
And it's been a week that's seen the spectacular arrival of the Olympic flame in Marseille, carried on a 19th century ship. French officials promising a Games like no other before. We'll look at whether Paris can avoid the curse of so-called white elephant syndrome that Athens, Beijing, Rio and Tokyo to some extent didn't manage to avoid.
The Games are back in our country and let's celebrate, let's share this fantastic moment of celebration with millions.
And with me from the International Press Corps this week, Pierre Aski, International News Editor. Hello to you from France Inter, President of Reporters Without Borders. Author, quite prescient at the moment, Une terre doublement promise, a doubly promised land. Here it is. I think a key time for your book to be launched. Pierre, looking in depth at the events in Israel, occupied territories, October the 7th and before.
Yes, I was a correspondent in Jerusalem in the 90s at the time of the Oslo Agreement, the only time of an attempt to make peace that failed. And so I tried, based on that experience and a lot of reporting on the ground, to understand why all this failed and how to get out of the current deadlock, deadly deadlock. And that's really the substance of the book. And it's a very tough situation because 30 years of non-solving the problem since Oslo have only aggravated the situation, if only with the number of settlers in the West Bank, that it was 120,000 in 1993 at the time of Oslo, it's 450,000 today. So the people thought, and Netanyahu was the first promoter of that idea, that it was under control, that you could live with no peace, no war situation where you built on the settlements and without too much noise. And October 7th put an end to that and made it more difficult now to get a peaceful solution once this war will be over.
Well, I'm glad we've got you this week, particularly given what's going on in the Middle East right now, particularly in Rafah. Vivian Waltz, seasoned correspondent for Time magazine, Fortune. You've just profiled Anne Hidalgo, Mayor of Paris, talking Olympics, looking at her low popularity rating, to which she said, "I don't care."
Yes, indeed. And I also just returned this week from another interesting spot, Saudi Arabia. So lots going on in the world. Yeah.
Great to have you on board. Olympics will be a key theme also today. Anne Bagamarie, Professor, Paris-based Europe correspondent for Law.com International. And am I right to say you've been studying the news this week? A few things have caught your attention.
Oh, I think it's been all stormy all the time for those of us in the legal journalism business. And it's been fascinating because Law.com, being the international component of a magazine called The American Lawyer, which is quite plugged into the legal scene in the US, certainly, and we've also got a big affiliate in London. We have access to some terrific legal minds who talk to us on the record, off the record, and just talk to us. So it's been a fascinating week calling up my old friends and sources and saying, okay, so what's going on in their heads in there? And, you don't have to be a legal geek to really appreciate that these high stakes games of jury trials, even if they're not televised, are really something to watch and marvel at. I mean, how do they do it?
And inside the court, I think people have had binoculars because there's no microphones, there's no cameras inside, so reporters watching facial expressions. We're going to get into that in just a moment. Also, Barzu Daragahi, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, long-time Istanbul-based journalist. Tell us what you've been watching this week.
Well, it's interesting for a project that I've been working on the side, just examining what is supposed to be in the coming weeks and months a complete massacre in the Chinese electrical vehicle space. It's interesting. China has a glut of electrical car makers. It has a glut of electrical vehicles and a really healthy competition, but it's really not able to export them to the West because of the mistrust. And this is where China is really paying a cost. And it would be interesting if someone would bring that to the attention of Xi, that the mistrust that he's causing, the hostility that he's causing around the world is hurting China more than anyone. Just today, there's reports that the U.S. is about to impose tariffs, special tariffs, targeting the Chinese EV industry. Look outside here in Paris. There's lots of EVs, very few Chinese EVs, if any. And this is one of the costs of China's actions.
And that also ties nicely into what we're going to get into, this tour of Europe in Hungary, the main plant for Chinese EVs as well, and whether they're being overly subsidized, whether they've had too much advantage already. Bozu, great to have you with us too. Let's begin. Early hours of the morning on Monday, the Israeli Air Force skydropped thousands of leaflets across the east of Rafah, the most southern city of Gaza, warning thousands of Palestinians to evacuate. A direct targeted operation, said Israel. Civilians displaced, forced to move again.
We fled death and destruction to seek safety in Rafah, only to find the same thing here. Where are we to go? The situation is so difficult. We're unable to describe it.
I fled from the north to the center, and from there to Rafah. Now, they are threatening Rafah. They will commit massacres here. It will be a genocide. We honestly don't know where to go.
The flyers direct people to, quote, expanded humanitarian areas, Al-Mawasi and Khan Yunis. Well, James Elder from UNICEF worked in both areas in the past few months. This is how he described those places to me.
I've never seen the devastation of a place like Khan Yunis in my 2 decades with the United Nations. Gavin, Khan Yunis is rubble as far as you can see, and that unfortunately speaks to something. That's not targeted strikes. When you are looking at 360 degrees of destroyed homes and buildings and apartment blocks, that speaks to the indiscriminate nature with which this war has been fought. That's why two-thirds of all homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. So there's nothing to go to in Gaza.
James Elder, well, the consequences of the operation, the fear of what's to come in a city of more than 1 million civilians, would have instant ramifications with the US, Israel's biggest military backer, in a war that started with unconditional support from Washington. Now a pause in a US weapons shipment heading for Israel, and an ultimatum from President Biden to Benjamin Netanyahu, talking and telling CNN that if the continued Rafah invasion becomes a bigger ground offensive, then key weapons shipments will stop. Pierre, let's begin with you. A bold move from the US, perhaps, in going this way to say we will stop this if this continues. Threatened for months. Do you think it was the right move?
Well, President Biden has been criticizing the way the Israeli war was going on since December, his first criticism, and he's been scaling up the criticism. He even said a few weeks ago that the way things were going was disgusting, which is a strong word in a president's mouth, and nothing was happening. So I think he had to do something because he looked like being manipulated by Benjamin Netanyahu. And the problem is that once you've decided that, and Netanyahu is saying he's going forward with his move, he's not going to be intimidated by President Biden. He even said we're ready to fight with our nails if needed. what will the US do? And you know, there's the more complicated situation is that you have the war in Gaza and you have the broader regional picture with Iran, with the Hezbollah, with the Houthis in Yemen. And so what will the US do if there's a war now starting with Hezbollah? Will it let Israel fight on its own? There's a whole range of questions that have started from this statement by President Biden, but it is a very important landmark in this conflict because the US has been the most powerful ally of Israel for decades. I mean, the US have given Israel more weapons than any other country in the world in the past 70 years. And therefore, announcing that you're not going to make any more deliveries is a very strong move. But it's created more questions than it's providing answers.
More questions providing answers, says Pierre. Vivienne, I just want you to watch two things. So first of all, the reaction from Itamar Ben-Gvir, far right of the government security minister, who said this, Hamas hearts emoji Biden. And then, as you referred to, Pierre, this we will fight with our fingers moment. This is what Benjamin Netanyahu had to say in response.
The War of Independence 76 years ago, we were few against many. We had no weapons. There was an arms embargo on Israel. But with our great spirit, heroism, and unity, we won. Today, we are much stronger. We are determined and we are united to defeat our enemies and those who seek our souls. If we have to stand alone, we will stand alone. I have said it before, if we have to, we will fight tooth and nail.
So Benjamin Netanyahu adding to this pushback, how would you read the state of Israel-US relations right now?
I mean, you know, the fact that Netanyahu sort of harkens back to the War of Independence, 1948, I mean, this is no longer the kind of land of milk and honey and making the desert bloom and the kind of, you know, mythology of Israel that generations, and particularly President Biden's generation, has grown up with. This is big power politics. Biden is facing a neck-and-neck race to be re-elected back home. And remarkably enough, the Gaza war might be enough to tip it one way or another. So, you know, that is a really urgent question for him. And secondly, I actually don't think this is so extraordinarily dramatic. He did say he was delaying weapons. He did not say he was halting them. There were a lot of ifs in his statement. If there was going to be an all-out assault on Rafah. He didn't say anything about if there was going to be a kind of marginal kind of incursion and, you know, operations in Rafah. And so I think that Israel has a lot more room to maneuver than its far-right insurgents, if you like, within the cabinet make it out to be.
Well, so Vivienne's saying, effectively, there's lots of get-out clauses, and we're seeing potentially a creeping of more directed manoeuvres. What do you think?
I think, you know, disastrously, Middle East policies in the U.S. no longer have anything to do with the Middle East, especially in election year. When you talk about Israel, when you talk about Iran, it's all about domestic audiences. President Biden faces a dramatic and potentially cataclysmic rift within his own Democratic Party over the issue of Israel. You've got, you know, riots at universities in the U.S. over this issue. You have, you know, disagreements within the party elite, among the rising elite in the party, the new breed like Raisha Tlaib and others, you know, who are more willing to be critical of Israel versus the old guard, Nancy Pelosi and her bunch from back then. This is coming up right now, right this second. This is about Michigan. This is about maintaining Democratic Party unity. Michigan has got a very large Arab population. If they stay home, and if Biden loses Michigan, he will lose the elections. I will make that prediction. And the only way that could happen in such a blue state is if the large Arab community in that state stays home. So he has to basically play a really, really kind of delicate game here.
Which he's already seen the risk of in previous votes in the last few months about who's going to be the leader of the party. A lot of American Arab voters staying home, not voting, and Joe Biden saying, if the choice between me and the choice isn't between me and the Almighty, it's against the alternative. But what if the alternative isn't Donald Trump? It's actually people not voting at all, and that's where you're getting the problem politics.
Exactly, and this is what he has. This is the balancing act he has to play right now.
And here's the issue, because for Israel, domestic politics matter, particularly for Benjamin Netanyahu. Many say he's between a rock and a hard place. The far right saying in the cabinet, if you don't go into Rafah, we're out. I want to know legally what your thought is when it comes to the cases of human rights activists who say some governments are pushing that if you arm Israel, you are complicit in war crimes. We're seeing a case in Nicaragua taking Germany to the International Court of Justice, alleging that that's what they're doing.
The lawyers who are looking at this issue closely inside and outside of Israel have told me that the question of war crimes and holding Israel responsible for war crimes is incredibly fraught. The rules of evidence almost don't apply. This is uncharted territory, and you have to assess the damages, which are not even close to being quantified yet. I mean, there was already a hearing at the International Court of Justice, and the judge's panel was not unanimous in condemning the actions of Israel in going in after Hamas after the October 7 attack. It's very, very shifting ground. I would like to say something, though, to follow up on some of the comments about Joe Biden's position and his statement that he might withhold weapons if. It's not an unprecedented move by an American president. The first one who really rattled that saber and did it very effectively was Ronald Reagan. And one reason he was able to do it 30, 40 years ago, it's 1982, so check my math, is because the composition of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel was very different than it is today. There was much more rock-solid support for using American power to lean on Israel to do what we wanted to do. But the question of supporting Israel was never on the table. It was just a question of how to use it tactically. Now, as you pointed out, the Democratic Party is split because there are people within the party, powerful people, who don't regard the Israeli government as representative of the Israeli state. You've also got in terms of American politics, you've got a Republican Party that is still campaigning on, we are strong for Israel, we stand united no matter what, and a Democratic Party where the issue is seen in a more, I will say, nuanced way, just as we've described, that Israel is not necessarily the government, just as, for example, Hamas is not the Palestinian cause. So it's going to be a very, very, very touchy thing for both of the candidates to navigate, I think, because even taking a stand, drawing a red line wherever you want to do it, you risk being very much on the wrong side of history.
Pierre, taking that into account, what Anne said about the complexity, the difficult opinions, the different opinions legally about complicity with Israel and alleged war crimes, what Vivian was saying as well about this potential drip-by-drip, step-by-step approach potentially in Rafah we're going to see, where do you see this heading?
You have different levels for this battle. You have the military battle, you have the domestic US fight for the presidency, and you have the international level. There's not a single country that has backed Israel on going into Rafah. Every ally or friend of Israel has said it should not go. Emmanuel Macron was on the phone with Netanyahu on Sunday to tell him not to go, the Secretary General of the UN, and so on. And you have the legal battle, and that's a very interesting battleground also. You've seen the impact worldwide of the South African move at the International Court of Justice. Now, last week there was panic in Israel because there was rumor that Netanyahu, his Minister of Defense, and the Chief of Staff would be indicted by the International Court.
Heavily reported in the Israeli press.
Yes, absolutely. And on Sunday, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement saying forced displacement of civilians is a war crime. and France is a friend of Israel. It's not an adversary of Israel. And putting out a statement like that, that was Sunday and Monday morning, as you reported, the leaflets came and said to the civilians in Gaza, you have to go in Rafah. So this is a multi-layer fight for support for different constituencies. And today there was this vote at the UN General Assembly, and there was a very heavy majority in favor of recognizing Palestine as a proper member state. And the US was one of 9 countries, including Palau and not Micronesia, who opposed it. And the Europeans, and that's another interesting point, the Europeans were very divided. Yeah. France voted in favor of the resolution. Germany abstained. UK abstained. And Hungary and the Czech Republic voted against. So you have a very wide range of opinions among countries that share, the same political spectrum, and that's part of the overall equation.
You talk of the multi-layered political dimensions, which brings us on to what happened this week here in France. The Col de Tourmalet. It's one of the highest mountain passes in the Pyrenees. It's known for being the single most iconic climb of the Tour de France, and well, there are lots of legends about it. Countless champions have been made on the Tourmalet, just as many have been broken. The Col makes or breaks you, the saying goes. Prescient, perhaps, for relations between France and China, where at the top of the climb on Tuesday morning, President Macron invited President Xi, bad weather too, snowing, to take in the view, the local delicacies in the mountaintop cafe called l'Étape de Bergère, the shepherd's stop. Meeting Xi, as you can see, some personal diplomacy. Well, Emmanuel Macron's childhood holiday hangout, he used the informal tu and not vous with Xi, gave him a Tour de France winner's jersey, shared wine, watched the local dancers too, following the pomp and the ceremony of Paris the day before, which saw Macron welcome Xi on his first state visit to Europe in 5 years. Let's have a listen to some of the pleasantries.
I would also like to thank the President for his openness about the temporary measures on French cognac and his wish that they not be applied as far as temporary measures are concerned.
Now, this wasn't an easy trip. Matters of war, trade tensions on the agenda. China accused of supplying dual-use technology to Russia in its war on Ukraine. Not the case, claims Xi.
China has stated its position on the Ukraine crisis on many occasions. China is neither a creator nor a party involved in the crisis. However, we are not watching the fire from the sidelines. We have always been playing a positive role in achieving peace.
So a 2-day visit, then off to Serbia and Hungary too this week. Vivienne, personal diplomacy, does it work?
What were they thinking? This is the 3rd time that President Macron has tried to kind of use his personal charm to win over effectively authoritarian leaders, President Xi, President Putin, and of course, most famously, Donald Trump, whom he dined with on top of the Eiffel Tower, if you remember. All of them, to a man, basically turned around and kind of brushed him off like some annoyance. It seems like it would have been a little bit more appropriate, maybe, with President Xi to take him to the Versailles Chateau instead of President Putin. He's likes to see himself as a big imperial figure, and he is. He is. His economy is vastly greater than France's. He has a lock on some of the most strategic minerals that France and Europe desperately need. Lithium-ion batteries. They produce most of the world's supply. The EVs are flooding the Western markets, and this was, I think, just a tone-deaf move. I don't know what anyone else thinks.
Pierre, you were there. You went to the States dinner. How do you read this?
I think there was a difficulty that last year I was with President Macron to China, and President Xi took him to the house where Xi's father stayed when he was governor of Guangdong province. Guangdong province, and so he had to replicate that with a personal dimension, and that created this silly trip to the Pyrenees. But there is a common interest of both presidents to look, friendly, because Xi Jinping he has to show that he's still welcome in some Western countries. China has an obsession with its relations with the US, rightly so, because both economically, technologically, and militarily, that's where it counts. And so his whole approach of world issues is based on what impact it has on his relations with the US. And France, therefore, is a good place for him to come and praise the spirit of independence of de Gaulle and from de Gaulle to Macron, in a way, and Macron has an interest in showing that he's not a vassal of the U.S. He's used that word several times, and so, but that's the surface on the issues, both on trade and on Ukraine, which were the two major issues. Not much has come out, to be honest, and I think Macron, and there I join this view that he's not getting anything from Xi on Ukraine, because Xi Jinping is not going to weaken Putin. First of all, a few months before the U.S. election, he will certainly wait to see who's elected in November to do anything. And secondly, why would he weaken Russia when he knows that this will not play good on his relations with the U.S.? It will only free the U.S. from to focus entirely on China, and that's you have to have that in mind, that China is obsessed by its relation with the U.S. and the rest is just a playground for that major confrontation.
Also, at the same time, you mentioned it right at the beginning, that Europe matters to China in terms of its electric vehicle market. In China,
for example, solar as well.
Solar too. So the tech world, and this is an area where you have US analysts saying that the tech market is, and Vivian pointed to it, with the global rare minerals, this is where China wants to openly dominate in future. From your perspective, watching this, what do you think President Xi is trying to get out of this week?
I mean, credibility domestically, as you pointed out, but also, I mean, look, the bottom line is that countries are afraid of China. They're terrified of China in a way that they're not terrified of the U.S. Let me give you one example. Vietnam, this is a country that was bombed by the U.S. and backed by China, and it is like civilizationally linked to China. And yet they're now cozying up to like Anthony Blinken and, worried about what China is going to do in the, South China Sea. Their big concern is China bullying other countries around. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this is just one example. And he's gone too far. Xi has gone too far. He's, on the one hand, I don't think that what Macron did hurts that much. It's not that bad to have a conduit for communications. But on the other hand, I mean, this is a guy whose economy is built on like slave labor and, human rights abuses. And that is not someone that you should be, kind of bringing to your hometown vacation spot and shaking hands and being all jolly. I think there's matters of principle involved here that Macron has tossed to the side.
And Bozo's comments, interesting. When we think back to the European Commission, European Council describing China as a partner and strategic rival, when you look at NATO describing it, China as a strategic threat to the alliance, systemic threat to it, more so than Russia in future, I just wonder whether you think it's Macron did the right thing there, trying to keep a personal relationship, keep the communication open. Could he have done anything differently?
Could he have done anything differently? Should he have done anything differently?
Or more openly critical, perhaps?
Well, here's the thing. I've been nodding along with everything my partners on the panel have said, and the word that keeps popping up into my head is sideshow. This is a sideshow to China's ambitions in the world. I don't know what Macron thinks he gets out of it because he never has to face the voters. Again, he's term limited. So charming voters is one thing, using charm in international relations is another. You mentioned some of the European institutions. What goes through my mind, too, is the European Commission has, and the legal community here in Europe has a very jaundiced view of China. If you look at some of the major developments in competition law, for example, foreign direct investment screening that takes place of mergers in the EU, these laws were put into place and stiffened over the last couple of years with one goal in mind, and it wasn't to prevent Siemens of Germany from taking over Alstom of France. It was to prevent anybody from China from taking over or investing heavily in a European country. So everybody's afraid of China's power. And they're also afraid, and we've hinted at this, at the fact that China seems to want to use its power without regard to some of the other, shall we say, guardrails that other superpowers might feel in being part of the world community. They don't care about being in the World Trade Organization. They don't really care if we don't like their human rights abuses. They just don't care. It's a country that is based on exercising economic power. And to the extent they can do that, they're pretty happy with their place in life. So all of these little sideshows, trying to establish better relations, yeah, sure, why not? But that's not what China cares about, and maybe deep down, that's not really what France cares about.
Well, from one leader where you say economic power matters to another former leader and possible future leader, according to Anthony Scaramucci on Donald Trump, he said two things matter to him. One is money, two is attention, flattery on him. And it was on the same day that President Macron was eating the best of Pyrenean cuisine with President Xi, 3,000 kilometres away in a New York courthouse. Donald Trump and his legal team got a surprise in the criminal trial when Stormy Daniels walked into court to give her own testimony, called in by prosecution as a witness. Now, Michael Cisak from the Associated Press news agency is covering the case from inside the courtroom.
Several times during her testimony, Trump's lawyers objected when they felt that she was going beyond the scope of what had been established as the ground rules. She talked about the sexual encounter in details that she was not supposed to, they argued.
Well, perhaps it was TMI for many of the jurors of her alleged one-night stand with former, as I mentioned, possibly the next president of the US, describing his black silk pajamas, his Old Spice aftershave toiletries, even the rolled-up magazine in which she said she smacked his backside, and suffice to say, many more intimate details. At the centre of this case, remember, it's not about Stormy, Stephanie Clifford and what she did. It's about being paid $130,000, hush money, allegedly, and what they did with the bookkeeping before the 2016 election was marked as legal fees, about campaign financing, what wasn't declared for the election. No mics, cameras, as we mentioned earlier. We saw Trump huffing, puffing, looking into the air, uncomfortable, we're told by the court reporters. This is him as he left the courtroom.
This was a very big day, a very revealing day. As you see, their case is totally falling apart. They have nothing on books and records, and even something that should bear very little relationship to the case. This whole case is just a disaster. If you read the legal scholars, you'll see, because they're writing about it, they've never seen anything quite like it. And neither have I.
And legally, how did you find Stormy's testimony? Is this kind of minutiae detail of a alleged sex life, relevant to a jury?
It is absolutely relevant in this trial. Now, the risk with this kind of detail is that she will put off some jurors. I mean, this is all theater to impress 12 people. It's good theater, but it's theater. And she's an actress, so she knows how to play to an audience, and she knows how to learn her lines and present an image, and she's not afraid of the spotlight. But the point of her going into that kind of detail, which, by the way, should not have been a surprise to anybody, because she wrote a book about it, and she had even more details in there. And she's had clothing printed with salient items from this night of whatever it was in Las Vegas. So it's not a surprise. What happened was that the prosecution put her up there to talk about that night, not because the sex was a crime. That's just never been the case. They put her up there to testify to it for two reasons. One, to show why Donald Trump would have been so worried about these details coming out that he would send his deus ex machina, Michael Cohen, to go pay her off, and then falsify his business records, which is the crime they're going after here, in order to cover it up. And by the way, it didn't have to be true for them to do that. They did that with a couple of other stories that turned out not to be true. But the crime was the falsification of the business records. However, the jury needs to know what that act was that was so repugnant to the idea of it getting out to Donald Trump. It was also to present, the prosecution's thinking they need to make her a credible witness. Why do they need to do that? Because, and this is where, I mean, you can laugh about it, but, and a lot of lawyers are, this is where a very experienced defense team completely dropped the ball. It was in the opening statements where they said, essentially, this never happened. The sex never happened, this is a lie. Now, that's Donald Trump's point of view. It's always been that way. Having said that in court, the prosecution had the right then to put up Stormy Daniels to testify in rebuttal to that. Oh, yeah, it actually did happen. That creates, they hope, credibility for her. And if it does create credibility for her, it robs Donald Trump of credibility, who said this never happened. So, did she have to go into that kind of detail? Even the judge didn't think she did, and he admonished her and admonished the prosecutors to instruct her better. But the judge also spoke up and said, I can't understand why the defense didn't object when she started going into these details. Now, there's a lot of kind of granular defense strategy stuff I could get into. Some defense lawyers never object because they don't want to call the jury's attention to what they're objecting to. They'd rather let it go and handle it elsewhere. But the fact is that what we've just seen this week was absolutely critical to the case. None of us can unsee or unhear some of the things that she said or reportedly said, but it was absolutely critical to the case.
Pierre, the issue that Anne mentioned, glitzy, salacious, entertaining for us all, the coverage may seem, it's enormous what's at stake though, isn't it? Because ultimately we've got at the heart of this a president who will affect the world on Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, and the legality and what's at stake here, one of 4 criminal cases. We're looking at how this reflects on the most powerful potential leader in the world.
It's a big surprise for me as a non-American, is that I've been raised with the time when any candidate who was supposed to have had a mistress sometime in his life was out of the race. We've had cases of during the Democratic primaries in the past where the pure allegation of a mistress was enough. And here you have this incredible show, which I must say is pretty enjoyable to read because it's it's an incredible
level of detail.
Yes, and my question is, how is it going to affect the election? Exactly. And Trump was famous for saying that if he shot someone on the Fifth Avenue, he wouldn't lose a single vote, and he proved that to be true. Is that going to be without any harm for his campaign? I'm not American. I'm not an American voter, and I'm on this side of the Atlantic, and I'm puzzled by that.
Well, Vivian, there's 2 points there, isn't there? Because on the one hand, this is the Trump getting energy, getting support from being the victim against, quote, the swamp, the state, the corruption. The more difficult his fight, perhaps the more popular he becomes to an extent. But at the same time, he's not campaigning. And it is Joe Biden right now who's got more campaign funds to use.
Well, that's true. Once again, as I said, this is a neck-and-neck race. It doesn't take much for one or the other to lose this election. In fact, it's just razor thin. And Pierre makes an excellent point. Will this make one bit of difference to Trump's electability? We knew all of this stuff before 2016. We had the Access Hollywood tape. We knew he was a total rogue. And he, in effect, traded on that in some ways. He was the guy that, nobody cared what he did. He was the bad boy. And as much as people thought that was disgusting, other people loved him for it. He might even think that there's some benefit to spending a night or two in jail if he's actually held to account for his violations of the gag order.
Yeah, he suggested that hasn't, and we've got more interesting witnesses to come in the case. Well, next, amongst the most spectacular scenes of the week were these. The old port of Marseille, Wednesday, the Olympic flame arriving. 11 days at sea from Greece, carried by a 19th century three-masted ship called the Bellum. It was smiles, waves as the French leg of the torch relay officially began, and is tradition unified to lift the spirit of a host nation with celebrities, volunteers, and the chosen ones carrying the flame to Paris. France promising the greenest, most different games yet, avoiding the curse of white elephant syndrome, barely used in years after, where we've seen stadiums that just lie empty or becoming wastelands. I guess the question is, for the panel tonight, can they do what other cities didn't? And Vivian, we'll start with you because you've recently interviewed Anne Hidalgo, who fought for this, I think, 4 times for the Olympics to happen. Is her dream, her vision then, do you think, the reality of what's being created now?
I mean, in some ways, yes. I think in some ways, if you look at Paris as it was 7 years ago when France won this bid, it's a different place. It's a bicycle city. We have many more green spaces. The whole move is towards making Paris a kind of green city. And I think, love her or hate her, you in some ways have to give credit to the mayor for that. That said, and it was a question I asked her, you never asked Parisians whether or not they wanted the Olympics. Many, many cities have referendums to decide. And she said if I'd asked them, they would have said no, which is quite true. They would have. However, she's had, referendums on all sorts of extremely small issues. But in this case, I think a lot of Parisians are very skeptical. Many of them are getting out of town, as they always do in the middle of summer. Personally, I feel, just my own point of view, that eventually I think the city will benefit for it. I think that it's accelerated a lot of things with new transportation lines, and I think ultimately the city will be better for it.
Briefly, Bozu, I want your take on, they're trying to improve particularly the Saint-Denis area, the whole area, one of the poorest in the whole of France. Do you think that will be, at this point, a legacy?
I mean, you had a great question. Is it going to be are you going to create a lot of white elephants? And I've, seen a lot of Olympic cities, and I've seen projects that stand the test of time and projects that don't. For example, if you go to Sarajevo, you'll see that some of the best housing in the city, some of the most coveted housing, is stuff they built for the 1984 Olympics. Meanwhile, if you just go outside of the city, you see these, incredibly desolate ski resorts and so on from that time that have, no use, and no one is using them anymore. So if you use, as Vivian pointed out, if you use the Olympics to accelerate, infrastructure in your city, like, as much as I hate the jackhammers, tearing up the streets and building real bike lanes, if you use it as an excuse to do that, you are going to avoid the white elephant syndrome. If you build, massive, monorails in the middle of nowhere to have, kind of Olympic Village access the Olympic facilities, you're going to be wasting money and creating, post-apocalyptic scenery.
In the time we have, just a few seconds, a final snapshot of what Vivian just said, starting with you, Anne. Who'll be here for the course of the Olympics? Who'll be following the footsteps of Parisians and disappearing?
We always leave for the summer, so we're not changing our plans.
Bozu?
I'll be in the US.
Pierre?
I won't be in Paris, I tell you.
I'll be in Paris, of course.
Perfect optimism. Thank you, Vivienne, Pierre, and Bozu. Join us this time in 7 days for the world next week.